So, what is it that actually holds our massive, complicated societies together? And maybe more importantly, what happens when they start to come apart? We're going to lift the hood on the machinery of society itself to really understand the forces of power, obedience, and change. It really all boils down to this one huge question. Is our world built on a foundation of agreement and shared values? Or is it just one big, permanent battleground for power? How you answer that, well, it changes pretty much everything about how you see the world. All right, so how do we even begin to tackle a question that big? Well, sociologists have come up with two very different ways of looking at it, like two competing lenses for viewing the exact same thing. The sociologist Rolf Dahrendorf had this brilliant idea that society has two faces. You can't just look at one. The first face is all about stability and consensus. It sees society as this well-oiled machine where everything has its place. But the other face, that's all about constant conflict, change, and struggle, a battleground. And here's the kicker. You absolutely need both of these views to get the full picture. Okay, so let's start with that first face, stability. What's the actual glue that keeps us all from flying apart? For an incredible answer to that, we have to travel way back in time, to a 14th century thinker named Ibn Khaldun, who was, no joke, centuries ahead of his time. Ibn Khaldun's big idea, his master concept, was something he called asabiya. Now, think of it as social cohesion or group solidarity. It's that powerful, almost magnetic feeling that binds people together. It's what allows us to cooperate and build amazing things, from a tiny tribe to a massive empire. For him, asabiya was the essential social glue. But of course, society isn't just one big unified block. It's also deeply divided. And that brings us to that other face of society, the one that's all about conflict. And there's no better way to understand that than by looking at the idea of social class. So you've got these two giants of sociology, Karl Marx and Max Weber, and they drew totally different maps of how society is split up. For Marx, it was pretty simple. It all came down to economics, to money. But Weber came along and said, hold on, not so fast. He argued that it's way more complex. It's not just about money. It's this three-way street of economic class, social status or honor, and political power. Let's just zoom in on Marx's view for a second. To him, society was split right down the middle into two huge warring camps. You had the bourgeoisie, the tiny minority who owned the factories, the land, all the stuff. And then you had the proletariat, the vast majority who have nothing to sell but their own labor. For Marx, this fundamental struggle was the engine of all human history. Okay, so if society is filled with all these deep divisions and constant conflicts, you have to ask, why doesn't everything just collapse into chaos? Why do people, for the most part, just follow the rules and obey the people in charge? It's a really central question, right? Do we obey because we're scared, or because we genuinely believe in the system? Or is it just because we don't feel like we have any other choice? Different thinkers have come up with some radically different answers. Thomas Hobbes, who was writing during a brutal civil war, had a pretty grim take. He imagined a state of nature, what life would be like without any rules, as a constant war of all against all. His solution? The social contract. We basically agree to give up some of our absolute freedom in exchange for security. We obey a powerful ruler because the alternative, total violent chaos, is just too terrifying to even think about. Now, Marx had a totally different answer. He said, it's not just about force, it's about ideas. The ruling class doesn't just control the factories, they control the culture, the schools, the news, the arts. They make their way of seeing the world seem like common sense. He called this hegemony, and it's this powerful, subtle force that gets people to accept a system, even one that might not be in their best interest. Max Weber came at it from another angle. He asked a more subtle question. Why do we see power as legitimate? Why do we agree that it's valid? And he found three main reasons. Sometimes it's just pure tradition. We obey because it's always been this way. Other times, it's the incredible, magnetic personality of a single leader. But in our modern world, he said, it's usually obedience to a rational legal system, a set of impartial rules and laws that we believe apply to everyone equally. So we've got these forces that create stability, and we've got reasons for why people obey authority. But societies are never, ever frozen in place. They're always in motion, always changing. So what's the engine that actually drives all that transformation? Let's go back to Ibn Khaldun for a moment. For him, history moved in a predictable cycle. It starts with a group that has super strong asabiya, that social glue, remember? They rise up and take power. But then, after a few generations of luxury and comfort, they get soft, complacent, their solidarity weakens, and that makes them vulnerable to a new, tougher, more unified group. And then, the whole cycle just starts all over again. Marx, on the other hand, saw things very differently. For him, change wasn't a cycle that just repeats itself. It was a one-way street, and the engine pushing us down that street was relentless class conflict. He believed that the internal contradictions of capitalism would inevitably lead to a massive revolution by the working class, which would create a totally new kind of society. And this brings us to a really crucial idea. Conflict isn't always a bad thing. In fact, as the sociologist Louis Kozer argued, conflict can be vital. It's like a pressure valve that releases tension, and it forces society to innovate and get creative. A society with zero conflict isn't a peaceful utopia. It's a society that's stagnant and decaying. Okay, I know these might sound like some pretty old, abstract theories, but they are incredibly powerful tools for making sense of the world we're living in right now. Trust me, these debates are far from over. They're happening all around us. Take, for instance, the political sociologist Seymour Martin Lipset. Back in 1959, he came up with this really influential idea. The richer a nation is, the greater its chances of sustaining a democracy. He argued that things like economic development and a large, stable middle class create the perfect soil for a healthy democracy to grow. Lipset also showed how these old, deep historical conflicts, like the classic battle between owners and workers or between church and state, they don't just disappear. They actually get frozen into our modern political systems. Those old fights are the very reason we have the conservative parties and labor parties that we see today. In a way, history never really ends. And what is just absolutely fascinating is how relevant these old ideas still are. Remember Ibn Khaldun's 600-year-old concept of asabiya? Well, today, we call it social cohesion, and it's something that governments all over the world are actively trying to measure and improve. They know that a society with that strong social glue is more prosperous, more stable, and way more resilient when things get tough. So we've come full circle, right back to where we started, with this constant push and pull between the forces that bring us together and the forces that tear us apart. And looking at our world today, with all of its incredible connections and all of its deep divisions, it leaves us with one last really critical question to think about. Just how strong is our social solidarity today?